You remember when I said things better than I can remember myself. He's got a wonderful memory, Paulette has, she continued, looking pathetically at her sister. I should be poorly off if he was to have a stroke, for he always remembers when I've got to take my doctor's stuff, and I'm taking three sorts now. There's the pills as before every other night, and the new drops at 11 and 4, and the fluorescence mixture, when agreeable, rehearsed Mr. Poulet, with a punctuation determined by a lozenge on his tongue. Perhaps it'll be better for Sister Clegg if she go to the doctor sometimes instead of chewing turkey rhubarb whenever there's anything the matter with her," said Mrs. Tulliver, who naturally saw the wide subject of medicine chiefly in relation to Mrs. Clegg. "It's dreadful to think on," said Aunt Pullet, raising her hands and letting them fall again. "People paying with their own insides in that way, and it's flying out of the face o' Providence. For what are the doctors for, if we aren't to call 'em in? And when folks have got the money to pay for a doctor, it isn't respectable, as I've told Jane many a time. I'm ashamed of acquaintance knowing it." "Well, we've no call to be ashamed," said Mr. Pullet, "for Dr. Turnbull has gotten such another patient as you I this parish, now old Miss Sutton's gone. Pullet keeps all my physic bottles, did you know, Bessie?" said Mrs. Pullet. "He won't have one sold. He says it's nothing but right folks should see him when I'm gone. They'll fill two o' the long store-room shelves already. But," she added, beginning to cry a little, "it's well if they ever fill three. I may go before I've made up the dozen o' these last sizes. The pill boxes are in the closet in my room. You'll remember that, sister. But there's nothing to show for the blouses, if it isn't the bills." "Don't talk o' your going, sister," said Mrs Tulliver. "I should have nobody to stand between me and Sister Clegg if you was gone, and there's nobody but you can get her to make it up with Mr Tulliver. For Sister Deanie's never on my side, and if she was, it's not to be looked for as she can speak like them as have got an independent fortin." "Well, your husband is awkward, you know, Bessie," said Mrs Pullet, good-naturedly, ready to use her deep depression on her sister's account as well as her own. "He's never behaved quite so pretty to our family as he should do, and the children take after him. The boy's very mischievous, and runs away from his aunts and uncles, and the jail's rude and brown. It's your bad luck, and I'm sorry for you, Bessie, for you was always my favorite sister, and we always liked the same patterns." "I know Tulliver's hasty, and says odd things," said Mrs Tulliver, wiping away one small tear from the corner of her eye. "But I'm sure he's never been the man, since he married me, to object to my making the friends o' my side of the family welcome to the house." "I don't want to make the worst of you, Bessie," said Mrs Pullet, compassionately, "for I doubt you'll have trouble enough without that. And your husband's got that poor sister and her children hanging on him, and so given to lawing, they say. I doubt he'll leave you poorly off when he dies, not as I have it said out o' the family." This view of her position was naturally far from cheering to Mrs Tulliver. Her imagination was not easily acted on, but she could not help thinking that her case was a hard one, since it appeared that other people thought it hard. "I'm sure, sister, I can't help myself," she said, urged by the fear lest her anticipated misfortunes might be held retributive, to take comprehensive review of her past conduct. "There's no woman strives more for her children, And I'm sure at scouting time, this Lady Day, as I've had all the bed hangings taken down, I did as much as the two gels put together. And there's the last elderflower wine I've made. Beautiful. I've always offered it along with the sherry. Though Sister Clegg will have it, I'm so extravagant. And as for liking to have my clothes tidy and not go a fright about the house, there's nobody in the parish can say anything against me in respect of backbiting and making mischief. For I don't wish anybody any harm, and nobody loses by sending me a pork pie, for my pies are fit to show with the best of my neighbors, and linen so in order as if I was to die tomorrow I shouldn't be ashamed. A woman can do no more nor she can. But it's all no use, you know, Bessie, said Mrs. Poulet, holding her head on one side and fixing her eyes pathetically on her sister. If your husband makes away with all his money, not but what if you was sold up and other folks bought your furniture, it's a comfort to think as you've kept it well rubbed, and there's the linen with your maiden mark on it, might go all over the country. It'll be a sad pity for our family. Miss Poulet shook her head slowly. But what can I do, sister, said Mrs. Tulliver. Mr. Tulliver's not a man to be dictated to. Not if I was to go to the parson and get by heart what I should tell my husband for the best. And I'm sure I don't pretend to know anything about putting out money and all of that. I could never see into men's businesses as Sister Clegg does. Well, you are like me in that way, Bessie, said Mrs. Poulet, and I think it'll be a deal more becoming of Jane if she have their pier glass rubbed often. There was ever so many spots on it last week. Instead of a dictating to folks as have more comings in than she ever had, and telling them what they're to do with their money. But Jane and me were always contrary. She would have stripped things, and I like spots. You like a spot too, Bessie. We always hung together in that. Yes, Sophie, said Mrs. Tulliver. I remember our having a blue ground with a white spot both alike. I've got a bit in the bed quilt now, and if you would but go and see Sister Clegg, and persuade her to make it up with Tulliver, I should take it very kind of you. You was always a good sister to me. But the right thing 'ud be for Tulliver to go and make it up with her himself, and say he was sorry for speaking so rash. If he's borrowed money of her, he shouldn't be above that, said Mrs. Poulet, whose partiality did not blind her to principles. She did not forget what was due to people of independent fortune. It's no use talking o' that, said poor Mrs. Tulliver almost peevishly. If I was to go down on my bare knees on the gravel to Tulliver, he'll never humble himself. Well, you can't expect me to persuade Jane to beg pardon, said Mrs. Poulet. Her temper's beyond everything. It's well if it doesn't carry her off her mind, though there never was any of our family went to a madhouse. I'm not thinking of her begging pardon, said Mrs. Tulliver, but if she just take no notice, and not call her money in, as it's not so much for one sister to ask of another, time 'ud mend things, and Tulliver 'ud forget all about it, and they'll be friends again. Mrs. Tulliver, you perceived, was not aware of her husband's irrevocable determination to pay in the £500. At least such a determination exceeded her powers of belief. Well, Bessie, said Mrs. Poulet mournfully, I don't want to help you on to ruin. I won't be behind-handed doing you a good turn, if it is to be done. And I don't like it said among acquaintance as we've got quarrels in the family. I shall tell Jane